So your sense that you don't have a monkey mind and you don't get distracted, here's another empirical claim I would just put out to you, is guaranteed to be a false one. Like if I put you in solitary confinement and gave you the practice, like all you can do, you can't watch television, you can't read, you can't distract yourself, but you can meditate. And here's how, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that now the goal is to pay attention to your breath. And every time your mind wanders into thought, you pay attention to your breath. You might initially feel that this is boring, you're restless, this is maybe hard to do, but you would, given what you've said thus far, you would very likely think you're doing it much more successfully than you in fact are, right? So you would
Mm-hmm.
think like, oh, if I asked you, for a postmortem on the last 10 minutes of meditation, you'd say, well, yeah, I was following my breath for like 5 minutes. I got distracted a little bit, then I came back, and the last 3 minutes I was following my breath. No way that's true. And if you spent 18 hours a day doing that for a month, at the end of the month,
Hmm.
you would be noticing just this torrent of white noise, of discursivity, which is preventing you from staying on the breath for, I mean, depending on how concentrated you can get, you could stay on the breath for some period of time, but staying on for a minute without getting distracted is a heroic feat. I mean, you've
You
never,
think?
absolutely.
Because you're talking to the guy who like wrote my undergrad thesis when my roommates were throwing a party and did not even notice.
So, well, I would say to you that this is easily testable, and if you have sufficient concentration, concentration meditatively is a very specific thing. To get lost in your work is one thing, and it is a kind of concentration. And a lot of the pleasure we get from being totally immersed in anything is actually the generic pleasure of just having a concentrated mind. It's intrinsically pleasurable to be focused on anything, regardless of what that thing is. But if you could pay attention to anything without getting lost in thought for minutes at a time, so if you just sat down and did that now,
Mm-hmm.
there would be neurophysiological, psychological, phenomenological correlates of that,
Mm-hmm.
which are very drug-like. It's like the immense pleasure that people get when their mind gets a little concentrated. Like, I mean, this bliss and rapture and a feeling of expansiveness in the mind where, your body disappears and consciousness
Mm-hmm.
seems like just a vast void. And the only thing that appears might be the thing you've been paying attention to, let's say the breath.
Right.
And even that might disappear and there's just nothing but pure consciousness. An extraordinarily pleasurable, psychedelic-like experience. If you were in fact as concentrated as you imagine yourself to be, that would be very accessible to you,
That's interesting.
right? And so again, this is another empirical claim
Yeah.
that is testable.
Yeah, it is. And when I hear you describe that, Sam, it sounds to me like you're basically talking about a flow state.
It's more than a flow state in the sense that, let's get back to flow states in a second. Another empirical claim I would give you is if you are able to really be mindful with sufficient concentration, you would notice that mindfulness is synonymous with a loss of a sense of self, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the feeling of being a self, being the subject in your head, and being the thinker of your thoughts, and being the sort of the agent in the middle, kind of riding around in your body, that is most people's default position. That goes away each time you're clearly aware of anything from the point of view of mindfulness.
Right.
And so it's analogous. It's analogous to a flow state in the sense that flow does have this character of losing yourself in the act,
Yeah.
like whether it's athletically or in terms of even a cognitive task.
Yeah. Even
Uh,
driving a car.
yeah, yeah,
Have you ever driven somewhere and not
but
remembered the turns you made?
but that is different. That is more the hallmark of distraction. That's more you're lost in thought and you don't even know it. You're just thinking about whatever you're thinking about, and yet that's still compatible with driving a car because so much of that has been taken offline and doesn't require conscious
Mm.
awareness. But no, the flow state is more when the thing you're paying attention to. I mean, it usually has a major sensory motor component, like you're surfing or
Right.
athletic events are very easy here. So, I mean, let's say you're shooting a basketball. When you have no conscious thought about how to do it, you're not worried about errors. You're completely in sync with the motor task, and there's an intrinsic pleasure there. It's like you're not. It's like your thoughts aren't getting in the way of your
Mm-hmm.
performance, right? And this can become especially salient in golf, where people get swing thoughts. I don't know if you ever play golf, but it's like,
Never.
yeah, it's an awful sport.
I'd rather
Uh,
meditate.
good. Yeah. But, there, the intrusion of thought, the difference between being in flow and being like, I think that in a round of golf, like a 4-hour round of golf, I think you make something like 1.2 seconds of contact with the ball. It's like that, like the actual sport
Yep.
is achieved in something like a second. And so the vulnerability of that to thoughts that are not helpful is immense. So the difference between flow and mindfulness is in flow or in being lost in your work, I do think people lose their sense of self,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah, that's
so,
one of the main Csikszentmihalyi findings, right? Is that you lose track of time and place, and yeah, even your ego.
yeah, yeah. And the neural correlates of that, I think, are fairly clear now in that what we call the default mode network is what comes online when people are between tasks,
Hmm.
when they don't have outwardly directed attention. That's why it's called the default mode. And it's reduced when people are meant to focus on something or asked to focus on
Hmm.
something. It's also reduced in meditation. It's also reduced with psychedelics. But the difference is there's not a recognition of the loss of self when you're in flow or when you're lost in your work. It's always retrospective. It's
You're
like
right.
you're
There's no metacognitive cognitive awareness.
yeah. And with mindfulness, with real mindfulness, and this is not the mindfulness that most people are practicing in the beginning. So the most of the people who are coming up to you at Davos saying, "I can't believe you don't practice mindfulness." These are not people who have enough experience in meditation for this to be true of them for the most part. But there's a metacognition with mindfulness where the loss of self is the thing you're paying attention to, right? It's no other thing.
Hmm.
And anything else that could be part of your experience in that moment, I mean, you could just be staring at your hand or hearing the sound of a bird or following the breath or watching television, whatever it is, that as long as you're clearly aware of anything, any of the contents of consciousness, anything is as good as anything else. I
Hmm.
mean, it could be an unpleasant thing. It could be nausea, right? Like you could just be, you could feel nausea arise. You could notice that it's unpleasant and recognize that there's no self that knows that. There's just the pure knowing of nausea. And there is a kind of equality of all experience that becomes, and this is, it can sound, subversive of much of what we care about, but it becomes its own source of well-being. Like there's a well-being that's intrinsic to the nature of consciousness that is not predicated on the contents of consciousness being one way or the other, right? And that's where
Hmm.
it becomes a kind of it becomes a kind of refuge where you can find your well-being before anything happens, before anything changes. So like if, whatever it is, you're sick, you're going to the doctor, you're hoping to get better, you're worried about what you might have, and again, real mindfulness gives you the power in that moment to, first of all, notice thoughts as thoughts, right? So your worry is being conveyed by the thought you just didn't notice arise.
Hmm.
And you can then become interested in the emotion of anxiety, feel the anxiety as pure energy, right? For the moment of making pure contact with it in that moment, it loses its psychological import. It just
Right.
becomes pure physiology, right?
Sure.
And then your actual state of consciousness is just acceptance and interest and openness, right? So you can become psychologically free of anxiety even while the physiology is still there. So your freedom in that moment
Sure.
isn't actually predicated on getting rid of anxiety, right? So then that's how it can be said that mindfulness isn't a matter of changing your experience, it's a matter of just being aware of whatever your experience is.
Right.
And yet doing that in any kind of sustained way does change your experience. So this was a very long ramble on the topic of mindfulness, but I would just say to you that one empirical prediction I would make for you is that if you could be as concentrated as you think you are in this domain, you would very, very quickly have an experience that would be
Right.
super interesting to you.
I like how you're trying to use my concentration superpower as a weapon against me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one
This is
has
an
to
effective
use the
technique.
weapon in hand.
Hey, I mean, at minimum, it makes the case that I should be able to spend less time getting to the point where I
Yeah,
figure out whether it's useful. But
all you need is 5 minutes in that case.
so I'm curious about two things that
Yeah.
that are interesting in the way that you articulate this. One is why it's so important to you to lose agency, because to me, getting to that state, it would be much more desirable to be able to control it. So I'd say, for example, if we take anxiety,
Hmm.
I'd much rather practice cognitive reappraisal and say what I often do when I feel anxious is, okay, I know that this is a physiological response. I know that I have the choice about how I interpret it. And so I can interpret it as anxiety, which means that there's some uncertain event in the future that I'm worried is not going to go well. Or, as a former student of mine has shown in some really interesting research, I could reframe that as excitement and say uncertainty
Yeah.
means there could be a good outcome as well as a bad outcome. And so, all I'm feeling is physiological arousal, right? And I have a choice then to say, all right, yeah, like maybe I'm nervous, maybe I'm excited, whatever it is, it's just a body, it's a bodily reaction that's millions of years of evolution favored, right?
Yeah.
And I don't need to let that have any power over me. I do that often, right? I would rather get there through conscious practice than I would say, okay, I've got to spend a whole bunch of time focusing on my breath and doing this meditation exercise in order to develop a skill that I could practice without any of that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I would say that reframing, I think, is an essential skill that does something different. And so it really is a both and recommendation here. So I would say that there are cases where reframing, I mean, I would actually put there's basically three remedies here, each of which is important. So one is just, well, let's take anxiety around public speaking, which is, I think you and I both have experienced. And I mean, I was pathologically afraid of public speaking,
Same.
early in life. And so this is a very common fear. So I would say there are three things that a person could do here. They're all useful. They address the problem at different levels, and none is a substitute for the others. And I would say for this, mindfulness is the least important, right? So mindfulness is more important, I would say, across the board. But here's I think you can see the difference. So mindfulness will allow you to truly accept whatever's arising in your experience, right? And so if you get anxious every time someone says, "Okay, now you got to go out on stage," or if you're just thinking about it, a month hence, and you're getting anxious, mindfulness will allow you to become truly equanimous with that feeling of anxiety.
Mm.
But just the nature of your mind is such that there's no way you're going to be perfectly mindful. In fact, most of your time, even while trying to be mindful, you're not going to be mindful. You're still going to be thinking about the thing that worries you. And in the best case, you'll be punctuating that with clear moments of equanimity and freedom, but the anxiety is going to keep coming, right? And so the reframing that you just described gives you we know that that the signature of the negativity of a state like anxiety is largely the conceptual frame we put around it, because as you point out, it's so physiologically similar to a state like excitement, right? So in one case, I'm excited because we're
Yeah.
going on a roller coaster. In another case, I'm anxious because I have to give a speech. They both feel like butterflies in my stomach. Why do I hate one and why did I pay $100 for the other, or whatever it was? And it's been a long time since I've been on a roller coaster. So the reframing can kind of snap you out of the whole problem. And there's more reframing to do than that. You can think about, this was perhaps the lone insight of philosophical existentialism. You can reframe the past. I mean, you can have something that embarrasses you from the past, that is a failure that
Sure.
that has wounded you, that it seems to be distorting your relationship to the future, and you can just think of that in a new way. Like, well, I wouldn't have all the opportunities I have now. I wouldn't have met my wife, but for the fact that I was the schmuck who did this thing then. And there's some way in which you can build a new apparatus to move forward, even with something that seemed objectively bad for you. But the third thing is just, you can get more experience, in this case with public speaking,
Yeah.
and have enough good experiences doing it such that you don't feel anxiety anymore.
Which is the route that I went, and I suspect you did too.
Yeah, yeah. And mindfulness is definitely not a substitute for that. Because I was the person who had a lot of experience meditating, had a real fear of public speaking, but I had done a lot of my meditating before I ever had an opportunity to speak publicly. And when I was confronted with the opportunity to speak, I was still anxious. I was able to be mindful of my anxiety, but absent actually having experience doing it, I was going to be anxious every time I had to do it, right?
Mm.
So it's like there was no substitute for
Yep.
the positive experience. But to answer your initial question, it's not about control, because I mean, I'm interested in not suffering unnecessarily. I'm interested in well-being, but I'm also interested in what's true, right? So it's not like I can't pretend to think I can control things that can't be controlled, or that I think I have a self when I don't have a self, or like, what is consciousness like empirically if you can pay sustained attention to it? There's a first-person component to scientific epistemology, which is virtually undeveloped in the West. And it was developed in the East outside of a scientific worldview, right?
Right.
So you have people who spent their 10,000 hours or their 40,000 hours training attention in a specific way and really coming into contact with a certain strand of empirical reality in a way that other people don't, but for using their attention that way. But it's being communicated within the worldview of 2,000-year-old religious
Yeah.
architecture. So I would just put it to you that it should be scientifically interesting. I mean, if you may not accept my initial claim here, but that would be easily testable by you. It should be scientifically interesting that it is so hard to pay attention to anything, right? And no matter what the stakes, like I would take this bet with anyone. And the moment we may actually have this, but perhaps not in a way that could be truly relied upon. But the moment we have a neuroimaging sequence or some other marker of this type of concentration, such that an outside reference point could signal to you, you just got distracted,
Yeah.
right? Then it would be an amazing experience because then you would find that no one could pay attention to anything for 10 seconds.
Sounds like your next app.
Yeah,
But-
no, that would be, yeah.
What I
some
find
thought to that.
fascinating about this though is that I honestly feel like I have the opposite goal. So I think one of the things we know about productivity is that it's helpful to have high attentional filters. Right? If you're good at keeping distractions out, you tend to get more done. You're more focused, you use your time more efficiently, you have fewer switching costs. But creativity is often the opposite, right? It comes from having low attentional filters, from being open to unexpected leaps and connections and more parallel processing.
Right.
And I feel like the biggest barrier to my own creativity is that my attentional filters are in general too high. And I would like to be more distractible because when I get excited about an idea or I have a vision for what I want to write, I basically sit down and I execute it in almost it's overly linear.
Yeah.
And so to me, the promise of mindfulness is sort of something that I feel like I overdo. I don't want to concentrate as much. I want to be more open to daydreaming. I want to be more receptive to hey, somebody just asked me a question that's not on the path that I was trying to move in this project, but I want to have the acuity of peripheral vision to make that pivot. And I guess you could say, well, mindfulness is about noticing in the present, and then therefore I'll get better at it. But I was just curious, what do you think of the idea of wanting to be more distractible as somebody who feels like I concentrate too much?
Mindfulness is not a matter of blocking thought. So here's another prediction for you. If you put yourself in a context like a retreat where the goal was to do nothing but pay clear attention to the present moment.
No, of course you would let those in.
Well, so yeah, thoughts arise incessantly. It's only with extreme states of concentration that they get suppressed at all, and those are just transitory states. So, and the goal is not to get rid of thoughts. The goal is simply to actually notice thoughts as they arise, as more appearances in consciousness. So now in the context of a retreat, given that this is such a difficult task, you've essentially made a rule with yourself, and this is what defines a retreat, that there's nothing worth thinking about. Like you're not going to follow. The moment you notice a thought as a thought, you're going to watch it unravel and then come back to. The truth is that for the longest time in a person's practice, the arising of a thought is synonymous with distraction. You don't notice it arise. It just becomes you, and you get on the thought train, and then after a few seconds or minutes, you realize, oh, I was supposed to be meditating. I'm actually sitting here in a meditation hall with my legs crossed with 100 people. And I thought I would, I'm busy, thinking about my career or my wife or whatever it was. So given that for the longest time, thought is synonymous with distraction, it can seem like thought is the enemy and that successful meditation is a matter of getting rid of thought. That's only true in classical concentration practices, which mindfulness isn't. So mindfulness is really just a matter of stepping far enough back so that you can notice everything that's arising, thoughts, moods, sensations, whatever it is, without blocking anything. And then I don't know if this is the third prediction or the fourth prediction for you, but if you put yourself in the context of a retreat like that, your experience would be of a supercharging of your creativity. You would have the best ideas you've ever had. And then the frustration would be, oh, fuck, I should be writing
I need to
this.
write them down.
Yeah, like
Get me out of the retreat.
Yeah, this is, and I've had several failed retreats where it's like, all right, I understand what the game is here, but I actually need to write this. Like I'm going to take a month and write. I've actually left retreats, or I've converted them into writing retreats, and it's a very, very common experience. If a person works in any kind of intellectually or artistically creative space at all, what you get is just this increasing temptation.
I believe that. I mean, it almost seems like an extended, more planned version of taking a shower, right? Where you've suddenly opened up access to lots of
Right.
ideas that otherwise don't make their way in. I wonder though, why is it important to you to change my mind about meditating?
Oh, I mean, it's not. It's just that. I mean, you're a public figure having public conversations about this, and I would just obviously I have my dog in this fight is that I just think it's important that people, you included, have the best ideas in any space. But this is something that I consider much more my wheelhouse than many other things.
Right.
Right. So this is like it's totally analogous to, if you had heard me on another podcast talking about organizational psychology or
Got it.
whatever it is, and saying things that were clearly based on my either misapprehension of it or my lack of experience or my having had a bad experience with somebody who, you knew was a fraud or whatever it was, and you just want to course correct. But in this case, it has the added element to it, which is the source of all the evangelism you've heard, both, wise and unwise, that on some fundamental level, this is a key to reducing psychological suffering. I tend to emphasize the intellectual interest of it. Like it's just fascinating to understand what consciousness
Hmm.
is like from the first person side. But the real sales pitch for meditation traditionally is this is about suffering and the end of suffering. This is about understanding why you suffer psychologically. And there may be some exceptions to this, but they're a rounding error on the main case, which is if you're suffering, you're lost in thought. To some degree, this is true even of extreme physical pain. It's like the experience of pain being unbearable is a kind of illusion where, because the pain that has arrived in the present moment, you've already borne, right? It's like what you're actually experiencing here is your massive resistance to the pain and your all the cognition that's going toward how do I get rid of this? How do I change this? What does this mean? Right. And there are massive framing effects, as you know, with pain, so that you can feel like if you imagine this is an example, forgive me, listeners, this is an example I've used many times before, but this is the best one because it's so easily accessed. Just imagine what the physical sensations of the hardest workout you've ever
Hmm.
done, right? If you woke up in the middle of the night feeling those sensations, with a different frame,
Be
right?
brutal,
Yeah,
but
but
the
you would,
workout was
yeah,
fun.
yeah, yeah. You'd call 911, you get the ambulance there, right? So the meaning you attach to it does a tremendous amount. So, but with physical pain, if you change the frame or take the frame away, there's so much fear about the next moment. I mean, so much of it is about
Yeah.
I can't bear this another moment.
Yep.
You've already borne it in this moment. And there are experiences you can have in meditation where it is amazing the level of equanimity you can achieve even with extraordinary physical pain. There are experiences in meditation where you can't tell whether it's extreme, but you can't tell whether it's extreme pain or extreme pleasure. It's like that the valence just
Huh.
gets erased. That's setting the bar very high. I don't want to give people the sense that if you're in extreme physical pain, you should just be mindful and not solve the problem. I mean, I take Advil as quickly as anyone else, but when you think of the inevitable suffering that we all experience in life and how much being lost in thought is the substance of that, I just think I mean, it is a generic recommendation I would make to anyone, not just you, that you look into this and, just having heard you talk about it is the thing that has prompted me.
Got it.
So.